also the relocation of the roof. I'm delighted to welcome you all here at City University. My name is Anastasia Nesvetadova. I'm a professor here of International Political Economy, and it's the third time in, I think, 3 years that we are honored and privileged to host the annual TGN convention. We are, some of our colleagues have been long associated with TGN work, and John and the team. And really, we are very lucky that they considered moving from the beauty of, Essex to the centre of London, because this is where we belong. A few logistical points before I talk about theoretical stuff and concepts. As you see, this is a beautiful room. We were given it yesterday once City University understood the enormity of TGN work and its global significance. So all the events, apart from the evening session today, will take place here. The evening session was started at 6, is happening in ELG 03. There will be directives that will lead you into it, but it's a basement in this long corridor. So you need to follow the long corridor towards Drysdale building and then come down to ELG 03. It's also a very nice room. But we couldn't have a session tonight today. Anything else about logistics? I think I will hand to John on the details because they organize the program. There is a Wi-Fi connection for guests, and if it's necessary, we will publicize it once Giovanni gets the details for today. What else? Okay. On a more serious thematic stuff, John asked me to talk as little or as long as I want. I want to be associated with all the great work that TGN does, but my only contribution is to basically reflect or apply the insights of the investigation and research to particular spots. So recently I was asked what effect would the Panama revelations have on the Kremlin and on Mr. Putin and on Russia. And I quickly agreed to write that piece because the conclusion was very easy to reach. No effect whatsoever. The only surprise that came out with Panama Papers, regardless of the news headlines and all the pictures of Putin and his friends and the cellist, is that the Kremlin greeted it with very calm indifference, partly because they were prepared for the news outbreak that had been contacted before. But partly because everybody knows that A, people in Russia steal, B, people on top steal a lot, but it's okay because they do it in the name of the state, and C, well, Putin himself is very much seen as an arbiter between very corrupt forces in the establishments, between the security, between the old oligarchs, between the new oligarchs, between various kind of ideological clans. And since he's consistently seen as this arbiter, as a protector, he's not really, he himself didn't really suffer at all. In fact, he later admitted that he cannot really sue anybody for the Panama revelations because they are in fact true. The only surprise in the Russian context came with the Panama connection. Panama is not the usual place cited by the Central Bank of Russia on the FDI statistics, FDI by the country of origin. I checked yesterday. The largest FDI investor in Russia last year was the Bahamas. It is a little bit out of line historically. Usually it was the Netherlands, Cyprus, Bermuda, maybe Luxembourg, but the Bahamas is the recent trend. Panama is not really it hasn't been on the official radar. So that's the kind of the only surprise, but then to specialists here, it's not surprising at all because Panama is used for trusts and for, I guess, really hiding the true origins of money as opposed to green offshores that were effectively authorized by the Central Bank of Russia. So, towards the end of that piece, I had to conclude, so what would be the effect? My most profound conclusion is that the effect for Russia will probably involve increasing costs and risks of partners doing business with the Russian counterparties. But in fact, the size of those costs and extra risks will depend on how the Western countries connected now to the Panama scandal are going to react to the revelations about corruption or tax havens about offshore. And it's true that some of them have launched initiatives. David Cameron, on the third day of his father's scandal, decided that he wants to criminalize the work, essentially of the whole of the City of London, because he thinks that advising on tax evasion should now be a crime. It didn't go, I think, very far on that particular day. But really, it all opens this very grey area between corruption as a matter of law and corruption as a matter of perspective. And when finance and financial structures play a role, this grey area becomes vastly more large. So with this profound insight from my little intake, I'm handing you over to much more competent people, and John Christensen is sitting next to me, and others who will follow. I think inevitably we will have people joining. If you have any questions about logistics, and please ask me to exactly remind you, the event is being live streamed into the web, because we actually had a lot of volunteers to come who couldn't be here physically. So if you are not willing to be filmed, please let us know. Please let Liz know. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you, early birds. Many familiar faces, and many familiar faces here. Many more people joining us. Thank you, City, for organising this great space. Literally at the last minute notice. This space was made available yesterday afternoon because we realised we didn't have enough space in the previously booked room. Is this thing working? Or is it not? It's not. I've been asked immediately to mention that the Twitter feed is #TJN16. So if you could kindly feed that into your, if you are tweeting, oh, hello, right. If you could use TJN16, please. But I would ask you just for a few moments not to tweet anything I say around this slide. The reason being that this newsletter is embargoed until Monday next week, and that's because it includes some really quite extraordinary survey details commissioned by us in conjunction with the University of Liverpool and other colleagues around the upcoming corruption summit, anti-corruption summit here in London, which was announced by the Prime Minister last year and gave us plenty of time to organise this event and various others, including the Panama Papers, of course. Now, we didn't actually organise that, but the timing wasn't entirely coincidental, and we were involved. When someone asked me the other day what Panama Papers meant for Tax Justice Network, it meant that our entire team were working full-time, day in, day out, for 2 weeks from the media. In my case, I had a media van, a broadcast van, parked outside my home for 3 days. And it was constantly in use, covering the media from across the world. And I know others like Richard Murphy and so on were in the studios constantly. It was a huge and remains an absolutely huge story. But in this newsletter, a copy of which you have here, please don't tweet anything at this stage. I count upon you. We talk about why Tax Justice Network sees corruption as such an important issue. Corruption, as it's been traditionally framed, has been largely looking at extortion, that is, demanding bribes, payments for doing certain things. We haven't had that much of a framing on what economists call collusive corruption. That is where you have a variety of different players and agents involved, colluding together. And collusive corruption is much more endemic in Britain. You don't normally have to pay a policeman a bribe to get off a parking ticket or whatever. That's not the way we do it in Britain. We do it in very different ways. But the survey results, which we're launching beginning of next week, make it quite clear that in Britain, people have a very sophisticated and strong view against corruption. 73% of the respondents said the practice of ministers, for example, accepting corporate boardroom appointments on leaving office should be banned. But it happens all the time. 75% of the practice of senior civil servants accepting corporate consultancies should be banned. 62% of the inviting private corporations into government to help shape the regulation of business should be banned. 68% said the current private finance initiative arrangements for public projects should be banned. We have a clear public understanding that many of these collusive arrangements between private and public spaces have become deeply corrupted. As I said, please do not Twitter or broadcast any of those things until they come out next week. But it's in that context that we thought that we'd help the Prime Minister with his corruption conference by framing it a little bit. I spent the wrong way. Here is the editorial from David White talking about corruption in Britain. David has a particular interest in corruption because he's based in Liverpool, and for those of you who've been following the media in the last 24 hours, you will know that Liverpool has been right at the centre of a massive ongoing corruption scandal which involved an entire police force. And David has been advising. And a few years ago, 3 years ago, I and friends sitting at the back, we were invited to a conference at Liverpool under the provocative title, How Corrupt is Britain? And of course the Hillsborough people were there to talk about the whole process of the corruption of the inquiry into police behaviour at that tragic event, which was finally remedied yesterday when it was proven that the police had acted unlawfully in the country and had corrupted evidence, had manipulated evidence, etc., etc. But I think he goes much, much deeper than that. TJ has taken a very provocative view about corruption, right from word go, and it was quite contentious to begin with. Richard and I had long discussions. Richard thought that corruption would divert our attention to the core issues at the time. I said, actually, we can completely reframe the activities of the agencies involved, that is the lawyers, the banks, the accounting firms, and other financial intermediaries, and we could build a large constituency of people who would support us, most especially in the developing countries, because they are the victims of corruption. This, by the way, is the book that came out of that conference last year. I have a chapter in it titled, provocatively, On Her Majesty's Secrecy Service, looking at the role of Britain's tax havens in providing the corrupting environment. Provocatively, we began by taking on Transparency International and the way in which they framed corruption along with the World Bank. We looked at their index, and here is the latest index, and you'll notice that the United Kingdom has moved up. It was 19 previously, it's now number 10. How did that happen? How did the United Kingdom, with all the LIBOR rigging, the currency rigging, everything that's emerged in recent years, emerged there? That does raise serious questions about whose perceptions and perceptions of what. And Tax Justice Network, in a typically provocative fashion, decided we would come up with a counter index. And I'll talk about that in just a few minutes' time, but I'm having to rush through this. But I've had a long experience of Britain's extraordinary corruption. In the 1980s, I was economic advisor to the government of Jersey. In the very early 1990s, a very close friend of mine, a colleague, a lawyer in Jersey, who ran a trust business, gleefully told me he just signed up a Russian client with assets of more than 100 million. I said to him, how on earth can anyone coming out of the former Soviet Union have legitimately obtained 100 million? Do you know your clients? What KYC have you done? Blah, 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 blah. But the Jersey regulators weren't in the slightest bit fazed by the fact that Jersey became one of the main conduits for Russian money coming in, typically via Cyprus, laddered on to Luxembourg, laddered on through Jersey and into the city of London, hidden behind covert offshore trusts and offshore companies. I'll tell you how bad the situation was. One lawyer, who I know very, very well indeed, was emerged as the director of a company called Fimico. Fimico was involved in a major money laundering scandal involving transactions coming out of Russia. He, in response, said, look, I'm a director of Fimico, but I'm a director of hundreds of other companies. I'm just a nominee. I have no idea what it was doing, what I was doing. I had no part in this whatsoever. I was unaware of what the company I'm a director of was responsible for. What was extraordinary about it was by that stage he was no longer in private practice. He was the Attorney General of Jersey. And he thought it was a good defence to say, yeah, I was a director, I was taking fees, but I didn't know what my company was doing. What an extraordinary corruption of the role of directors. On and on. In 2006, provocatively, Fred and I were invited to the Royal Geographical Society, and I gave a talk, intentionally provocative, about Corruption Perceptions Index, saying it's time that we now address the role of the intermediaries, the banks, and so on. And I gave a paper called Mirror, Mirror on the Wall, Who is the Most Corrupt of All? And that paper got me into a whole heap of trouble. I don't often end up on the front page of the Daily Mail, but that was the response to giving this paper. And perhaps I'm getting a little bit paranoid in my old age, but shortly afterwards I was arrested by British agents at Luton Airport and held, prevented from going to a UN base. And I come to the conclusion, after a lot of discussion, there was an inquiry into that. Sol, who's just arrived, was actually present. He and I were flying out at the time. I've come to the conclusion that was an attempt to smear Tax Justice Network, because we were treading on some very, very big toes at the time. So there you go. Nick Shaxson and I have been looking more broadly at the political economics, with the framing within which this happened, and we published a book called The Finance Curse. And for those of you who know anything about political economics, should be familiar with the idea of the resource curse, which directly impacts oil and gas exporting countries. Nick and I have come to the we've looked at this, and the evidence suggests that countries with an overlarge finance sector, an offshore financial sector which is much, much greater than the domestic needs of the economy, are very prone to a similar phenomenon: economic degradation, political degradation, and corruption. You can download that monograph free from the web if you're interested in reading it further. But we say that one of the aspects of the finance curse, similar to the resource curse, is this corruption. But what's different about the corruption in the City of London is that they don't like, they want law and order when it comes to policemen not taking bribes. They want a clear perception that the place is squeaky clean, because what they're after is selling services, typically outside the jurisdiction, which support the flows of dirty money, support the tax evasion, support the tax avoidance, and so on. So they give the appearance of being squeaky clean without actually being that way. And Tax Justice Network, in response to the Corruption Perceptions Index, in 2007, we mapped out a counter-index, the Financial Secrecy Index, which tells a completely different story. Here you have the 2015 results published last November. Switzerland, Hong Kong, United States at the very top. These are the main begetters, the supply side of the services that enable corrupt practices like tax evasion and so on to happen. Illicit financial flows. So these are the places which sell the secrecy behind which so many of these corrupt practices happen. This index, I think, has done more than anything else to reshape the corruption debate in the last 10 years. Richard, at the back there he is, Marcus, Alex, Petar, Sol, over there, these were the people who framed this, designed the index, and have built it up into what it is today. We are very ambitious that it will become one of the world's main indices and feed into a load of other metrics for examining corruption and hopefully shaping market perceptions of corruption in the years to come. So finally, to round up, we think that it's time for the world to come to a rather different view of what is corruption. The World Bank and Transparency International have defined corruption in ways which we think are very limiting. And we don't think that was accidental. We think it was purposeful. They wanted to focus largely on the bribe-taking, by public officials because they had an agenda to begin with. Certainly the World Bank, and in my discussion, they had a clear agenda. They wanted to sort out the public sectors of the poorer countries. We wanted to broaden it out considerably to look at the way in which people who hold any kind of power can undermine public confidence in the integrity of the rules, the systems, the institutions that promote public interest. And that includes especially people who have privileged positions like lawyers, accountants and bankers who clearly provide an important supply side to corrupt practices. I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to leave it there. Welcome to this event. Alex Cobham over here has directed the event and quickly will talk you through the program, which I think is an excellent program. I'd like to say a special thanks to the people who responded. Normally, it takes quite a long time to get a program like this together. Alex somehow managed to get, within a matter of weeks, a fantastic response. We were spoilt for choice with papers. We had far too many submissions. We apologise to those we couldn't include, but I think we're confident that we have included some really excellent papers this time, and I'm really looking forward to it. I hope you are. Look forward to speaking to all of you. I'm going to hand over to Alice to get proceedings underway.
Well, thank you very much. Can I ask the first panel to come up and bring your slides with you, because we haven't prepared that already? I'm not going to talk through the program, thank you guys, because you have the program, but mainly because it's a pretty straightforward program. We are, as John says, the index and a lot of our work has been about reshaping the perceptions of corruption. The reason we're having this event now in April rather than in July as we normally do is because the UK is holding the International Anti-Corruption Summit on the 12th of May. Now, that summit itself is a measure of how far things have moved. If you'd held an anti-corruption summit 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, you could have expected, especially in the UK, the focus to be on kleptocratic leaders of low-income countries. And that's not what the summit's about. You know, the summit is about the UK's financial secrecy network and the extent to which it promotes corruption around the world. And that is what our programme is about. In a sense, the range of aspects of financial secrecy driving different forms of corruption, from individual tax evasion and the theft of state assets through to multinational tax avoidance. This first session, I'm not going to introduce because Ms. Nelson is going to introduce. I'm going to shut up. I'm going to hand over to Liz, who is the director of Tax Justice Network, and your chair.
Can you do some techie things? Because we've got some. This is Robert. That's
Do you want me to pass?
I don't think so. If you just, I can't remember. It might be in an encrypted area. It might not be.
These problems with secrecy.
So just while, is this the Wi-Fi? No. So just while we're doing some techie things, I'll do a very brief introduction. So as you can see from the programme, this session is called Corruption and the Role of UK Tax Havens. And we have three presenters today. So everyone's going to, I know we are running a little bit behind, but I still want to give our three presenters at least 15 minutes And then Ronan Palin, who is a professor of political economy here at the City, will be our discussant. And then we'll have some time for questions. The amount of time we have depends on when we get the presentations loaded up. So our first speaker will be Robert Manumba, nearly right. And so Robert trained as a diplomat. He studied international relations and currently works at the East Africa Tax and Governance Network. For those of you who haven't kind of clocked it, there is the Wi-Fi password at the end there, which I know is difficult to see. Okay. So, Robert, would you like to start? And I'll kind of keep an eye on the time.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Robert Manumba. I work for the East Africa Tax and Governance Network, and I'm actually here just to make a submission on the issue of looking at corruption and tax havens from a human rights lens, which I feel is often a debate that is not pushed to the fore. But I actually thought that the good thing about my presentation, the title was all about the gloom and doom and how corruption is wasting human rights. That got me here, but so I'm actually happy to hear that there is some merit in the paper that I submitted. But notwithstanding, I'm just going to go straight into looking at the overview of the presentation, which is basically looking at who the East Africa Tax and Governance Network is. And then just to situate this conversation around East Africa and Kenya specifically. And then the paper just basically tries to look at how tax havens and corruptions affect governance, the resource-based perspective. I want to espouse a hypothesis around what I call the triple threat of the triple threat hypothesis, and then to look at what is actually happening. Now, so the East Africa Tax and Governance Network is basically a network that focuses on taxation, governance, public policy, research, and capacity building. Our main aim is just to influence a just, transparent, and citizen-driven tax system, because we realize that there's a huge disconnect between the citizenry and the government in terms of how they interact with the whole issue of taxation. We have about 28 members, and we work through national platforms in Burundi, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda. Now, in the beginning of this year, there's a real outcry around the cost of living in Nairobi, and it coincided with the fact that there's a new excise duty bill that came into being. But at the same time, the bill was actually being pushed through the House of Parliament. There was another amendment that sort of proposed an increase to powers for state offices. And this was interesting because it shows a very clear disconnect between the elite and the citizenry. And in this case, the elite who occupy political spaces. Now, according to Oxfam International, there has been a sort of growing inequality around who owns what generally in the world, but it's interesting to note that only a few, I think they put the number at about 62 individuals own about 50% of the world. And that speaks to a very interesting dichotomy between those that are wealthy and those that are not. And it goes beyond, for me, the issue of those that are in power, but it also talks to the conduct of multinationals. And it's interesting to look at the holding rights. The companies which have oil rights in Kenya are, one, registered in tax havens, and two, what is the implication of what sometimes is termed as aggressive tax planning. So is it an issue of profit maximization, or is it a deliberate attempt to undermine the potential of actually raising revenue within the country? Now, just to give you a small sort of example from Kenya, where we had two individuals, high-ranking in this case would imply a cabinet secretary and a high-ranking state official, who have been accused of 53 counts relating to commissions that were paid out to secure lucrative contracts. Now, the contracts were in the energy sector, curiously enough, and the amount that is being put forward is upwards of 1 billion shillings, which translates to roughly about 10 million US dollars. Now, it's interesting whether actually this amount was stashed, which is Jersey Island. Now, the one thing that I'd like to actually put forward is the fact that East Africa is not far removed from this global conversation, and Panama might as well have been called a tax havens. And the curious case of the two individuals who've been accused of this receiving commissions actually centers East Africa and Africa as a whole within this whole conversation around tax havens. Now, there's a report that came out known as the African Union High-Level Panel Report on illicit financial flows, which is also popularly known as the Lecky Report. And it basically tries to classify illicit financial flows into three broad categories. The first one is it looks at how commercial activities contribute towards illicit financial flows. The second one is criminal activities, and the last, corruption. Now, the interesting thing for me is that what role would tax havens play? And for me, they actually create a legitimate instrument through which illicit financial flows are perpetrated. We have to look at the role of taxation in this discussion, because this principle, it becomes a very key source of revenue for any state. And you can look at it in terms of the right to tax, which look at the legal provisions hinged on public financing, and the obligations to tax, which looks at the functional properties and ability to maintain a social contract. Now, scholars like Atia Waris actually try and look at what is the merit of having a low tax rate, which sort of speaks to an inability to meet public financing obligations, versus a high tax rate, which leads to sustenance by workers and businesses structuring activities around aggressive tax planning. But I think for me it's important to look at the sort of loss of revenue as, one, undermining the tax base, two, undermining service delivery, and three, undermining human rights, which is exactly where this conversation should be situated. And I like the fact that John Christensen actually spoke to the fact of, to the point around definitions and conceptions, and how they limit the interaction of taxation and human rights. And for me, it not only limits or exposes great areas in which a lot of malpractices is actually affected, but it also creates an exclusive club of experts. Now, and these tend to be dominated by accountants, lawyers, economists, you name it. But beyond that, I feel that the IFF's debate is a manifestation through which corruption and drawing from an economic perspective, which looks to legalize offenses within the economic sphere, such as that was put forward by Susan Rose Abraham. And unfortunately, corruption cannot just be limited towards an economic sphere. You can't interrogate it from that lens alone because its preponderance traverses the social, political, ethical, and moral sphere. Not just to paint a picture of gloom and doom, I mean, there are legal and policy prescriptions that try and address issues of illicit financial flows, especially looking at it from sort of three classifications. But it's also important to take cognizance of the fact that tax havens exist within this policy and legal frameworks. And some of the sort of ideas that are put forward to justify the existence of foreign direct for tax havens is mainly to attract foreign direct investment. In most cases, we look at tax havens as a conduit for attracting savings, eliminating barriers to doing business, and raising countries' borrowing limits. Now, if the argument for tax havens is economic growth, then it's interesting also to look at what other scholars have been saying about some of these theories around economic tax havens as increasing foreign direct investment, which automatically then leads to sort of the enjoyment of human rights. But Amartya Sen actually argues that high incomes do not necessarily translate to the well-being of the individual. And scholars like Ben Shepard also push the fact that economic growth does not necessarily translate to the upholding of democratic tenets. So the continued interplay of social and political factors in economic growth cannot be overemphasized. In essence, one cannot base the economic growth as the sole consideration for establishing vehicles that foster economic activity and whose effects are used to justify and surmise a trickle-down effect for social cohesion and progress. I think a conscious effort has to be put in to promote human rights and safeguard these, especially when we look at it from a government perspective, which has to be a deliberate effort. Now, unfortunately, in 2014, the G20 high-level principle on beneficial ownership transparency took an incline towards corruption, tax evasion, and money laundering, but at the expense of emphasizing their correlation with human rights. Now, when we try and sort of situate this conversation, we have to look at Africa, the African economy and how it's projected to grow, especially looking at the telecommunication sector, agricultural sector, the extractive sector, the financial services sector, which all speak towards big business. Now, big businesses, unfortunately, speak to big opportunities for corruption. And the context becomes very relevant when you look at the statistics. Interagency transactions within multinationals consist upwards of about 60% of global economic activity. And this is a huge percentage when you look at it in terms of who's doing business with whom. In 2014, almost 72% of Fortune 500 companies actually operated within tax havens, or had subsidiaries within tax havens, And if you look at it in terms of the growing interest to do business within Africa, it may actually speak for potential revenue loss and subsequent degradation to access of social services. And I think beyond the risk of losing revenue from corruption and commercial activities, governments seem to be clamoring around giving tax incentives which further erodes the resource base of any country. So you sort of have a situation that's bad, that's being accentuated by those that are in power. And it becomes a very curious case because it looks like those that are in power, without looking at the cost-benefit analysis of offering this tax incentive, run to do these things, and at the expense of other practices that are being actually orchestrated by multinationals and individuals to safeguard and contribute to their own wealth. To me, corruption then becomes a key conduit to illicit financial flows, and it's bigger than its share with respect to the loss, one, in public funds, but also through the opportunities it creates for illicit financial flows. Tax havens become very important because they provide a sort of intrinsic web whose navigation is often shrouded in secrecy, playing a very key facilitator role. And it only makes sense that the systems then try to legitimize themselves within the existence of the global financial architecture. So tax havens don't simply exist to provide an escape from taxation, but create secret societies that enable multinationals and individuals to disregard their societal responsibility while enjoying the benefits therein, which speaks to issues of breeding contempt to the rule of law and impunity. So is there really a justification for progressive realization through the rhetoric of insufficient funds? And for me, if you look at it from the perspective of leakages, it's a very curious case that needs to be examined more closely. Now, just to cite an example from Burundi, which had aimed to reduce under 5 mortality rates from 164 in 1000 to 63 between the period of 2000 and 2015. And you look at it, they only actually managed to reduce those numbers by about 1.5%. I think this was done in 2015 rather, because this is an example that's cited in the African Union high-level panel report. And they only managed to do about 1.5% of that, which meant that Burundi would take about 63 years just to meet this goal. But when you juxtapose this against the 6% of GDP that is lost by Burundi to IFS, it meant that they would be able to actually achieve their goals within 25 years. Now, there's also a critical issue of corruption and how it interplays with the state. And unfortunately, a lot of African constitutions, this is according to a paper that was written by Axel Wattis, place an emphasis on revenue generation function rather than the reciprocal relationship of the function of the taxes. Now, this is evident in such strong language as duty of the citizen to pay taxes, the imposition of taxes by the state, and the power of the state to tax. This essentially speaks to a disconnect in the conversation between taxation and human rights. And it begs the question, who is at the center of the state? And perhaps it actually characterizes corruption through individuals that wield power and tend to feel that they are bigger than both the collectivity of the social contract and the purpose of the state. The act of malfeasance against the state is embodied in corruption, and it takes away not just state resources, but it destroys the legitimacy of institutional mandate. You also have to look at corruption from how it interplays with power, and especially in jurisdictions where influence or positions or elected positions are actually dependent on how much money you put into an election. And for me, it actually speaks to prioritization of human rights against the elite's interests. And in most cases, you find that those that tend to occupy this very powerful position tend to accumulate and maintain power and resources as the primary objective.
Robert,
2 minutes. So, for me, the issue of tax havens is actually an antinomous to international human rights, because you cannot have a system in place that perpetuates structural injustice through undermining fundamental human rights. It's really not a question of resource deprivation, but the perpetuation of a structural injustice that is manifest through human rights abuses and epitomized through inequality, oppression, and exclusion. Now, just to run you quickly through what the triple threat sort of hypothesis that looks at oil holding rights by companies in Kenya, which are one, enjoy quite significant tax incentives from government. And I'll give you the case of Kenya where the revenue is split between cost oil and profit oil, and within the profit oil, the government and the companies share the revenue. Now, the Kenya government's share of the profit oil actually goes to cover the taxes that some of these companies that are supposed to pay. So in essence, the company keeps its share, but government has to look at how much the company has to pay in taxes and cover that, and then recoup its share within that same profit oil. But at the same time, the incentives are not the only thing that stand out, because most of these companies are actually registered in tax havens. And curiously, some of these tax havens actually have double taxation agreements with the Kenyan government. So you have a shifting of profit into this tax havens, which significantly compromises the taxing rights of the company, of the country question. The deliberate effort to deprive states of much needed resources to provide social subsidies in themselves is a form of abuse. One, you can look at it as an act of commission, which is the failure to remit the requisite taxes based on conduct of business in a given jurisdiction. And secondly, it's an act of commission, which is the active effort to avoid taxes. Now, tax havens play a facilitatory role in human rights abuse, and efforts by organizations like Tax Justice Network Africa to institute a campaign called Stop the Bleeding speak to very active efforts to address this peculiar challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. We're going to, just because we are a bit tighter in time, just move straight into our next speaker, which is Dr. Mary Young, who's a senior lecturer in law at the University of West of England.
Okay, I'm going to stand because that's what I'm used to when I lecture to my students, and I don't feel so comfortable sitting down, so I do pace a little bit. Okay, we're short on time. Thank you, Liz, you've introduced me. So I'm going to be talking about the fact that offshore financial centres, or secrecy havens, as Tax Justice Network call them, they create criminogenic environments. Now, as all good academics start, when they present a paper, I'm going to tell you straight away it's a work in progress. Okay, so be kind. And we'll go through it now. Okay, for questions, obviously, at the end. So that's just a fun little cartoon there. I quite liked it, so I put it in. But what does criminogenic mean? So I'm a socio-legal scholar who conducts empirical research, but I dabble in sociology and criminology as well. So what does criminogenic mean? Well, Clark's definition of criminogenic is that there are certain dynamic risk factors or criminogenic attributes or needs which contribute to the rate of offending. So if you're looking at that in terms of the individual person, there are risk factors which contribute to a person committing a crime. Faberman, in 1975, looked at the automotive industry in the United States, and he found that within the automotive industry, there is a structure there which feeds a criminal environment. So he looked at structural conditions. Gibbons, who looked at the causes of criminal behaviour, said there are situational factors which contribute to people committing crimes. Now, I've taken all of this, which is sociological, criminological, and legal theory, and I'm saying, well, hang on, how do we apply this to the physical space, to the offshore financial centre? I believe offshore financial centres are criminogenic in nature. I believe they breed criminality, but how am I going to do it? How can I apply principles from sociology and criminology and apply them to the physical space? So I sort of took Faberman's original statement, I've crossed out his words in black, and I've put my own words in red. It can be almost that Faberman wrote this statement on the criminogenic structure of the automotive industry. It's almost like he wrote it to apply to secrecy havens. So I've now made it to read: the role that lawmakers and heads of commerce and industry play in controlling society's financial institutions by establishing financial secrecy laws which set structural conditions that enable other lower level people to launder money and evade taxes. So within the automotive industry, remember, that's what Faberman was concentrating on. He was saying there are these elite people who are high up within their government structure or their company, and they set policies which are conducive to law breaking. We see the same in offshore financial centres, apart from we're looking at government policy makers, we're looking at norm makers, we're looking at the people who create secrecy legislation. They are creating policies which enable other people to break the law. So whether that's people who have never committed an offence before, who will then decide to evade paying taxes, or it could be a criminal who is looking to launder his money. Either way, I will reiterate it again, secrecy laws breed criminality. So then I look at Chapman and Hoff. Now Chapman and Hoff talk about criminogenic needs in relation to the individual offender. Their seminal work was based on the probation service, and they looked and identified points which made a person more likely or less likely to reoffend. So Chapman and Hoff said that within each offender, there is usually a lack of belief in relevant law. So we then have to apply this to a case study. I chose the Cayman Islands. I've become quite well known for picking on the Cayman Islands. It's something I like doing. It's fun, okay? Yeah, we get our kicks in different ways, what can I say? But Chapman and Hoff assert that a lack of belief in relevant laws is a criminogenic risk factor in offending, and it's exclusive to social circumstances. Well, I've looked at this and kind of done a reverse version. Actually, in the Cayman Islands, we see that a strong belief in secrecy laws undermines a belief in anti-money laundering legislation and policy. So what you have is you have a very peculiar social circumstance in a small island state like the Cayman Islands, where people are very defensive and strongly believe in the legitimacy of their secrecy laws. This strength of belief, in turn, undermines their belief and respect for anti-money laundering policy. Okay, so the one undermines the other. We all know that you cannot have a secrecy law that operates in the same country as a confiscation law, because secrecy doesn't allow the confiscation of proceeds of crime to take place. So this sort of slide that's behind me now just shows how I've applied Faberman's theory and Chapman and Hoff's and sort of turned it on its head and said, actually, yes, we can apply criminogenic needs models to the geophysical space. It's been done before anyway. We've seen criminogenic needs models apply to landscapes which are more conducive to the number of burglaries, or what pubs do, why pubs are conducive to bar brawls. So we've seen it applied before in the geophysical context, but we've not had it applied before in offshore financial centres. So I've done a nice little arrow there. I've even quoted John, actually. He says that a strong belief in secrecy laws creates an environment of legally backed secrecy. That is the criminogenic factor, guys, okay? That's the criminogenic factor, the criminogenic need are the secrecy laws, okay? In turn, if we're looking at Chapman and Hoff, this lack of belief in one law is only strengthened by the belief in secrecy legislation. They pay scant lip service to anti-money laundering legislation. I've carried out observations in the Cayman Islands and other offshore financial jurisdictions. I've worked with the people that work in government and law enforcement, and they pay scant lip service to these laws, okay? They are not bothered about prosecuting anyone who they think is involved with money laundering. They will tell you otherwise, though. Okay, so let's apply it to the Cayman Islands. How am I doing for time here? Okay, cool. Cayman Islands. The Confidential Relationships Preservation Law was drafted in 1976, revised in 2009. Boy, it's fun to read, okay? Go and find it on the internet and read it and pick it apart. You will be appalled. So, Moranto's Ants, okay, my favourite firm. They say that the CRPL is sometimes referred to as a secrecy law, but this is a label which is misleading. And this is on their website. I took it from their website, okay? Of course, I totally disagree with them. And then we've got my friend Simon Dixon, okay? He's a head, whatever, at Moranto's Ants in Cayman Islands, heckled me in Cambridge at a conference in 2015, and then asked me this question. Yeah, okay. It's a word, Simon. It's real. It's a part of criminology, sociology, and law. But Simon Dixon, who is a staunch advocate of secrecy legislation, refused to believe that there was a problem. He said I was peddling a mythology, that I was making lies. Even when I was speaking on my feet, he was heckling me. Very rude, but I accepted his heckles. He didn't like being threatened. He said the Cayman Islands had done him good. An Oxbridge-educated barrister in the Cayman Islands, and the Cayman Islands have done him good. Done him good, okay? So he was quick to wipe out any criticism of the Cayman Islands secrecy legislation, even when I pointed out they don't prosecute. They have no money laundering prosecutions. There are barely any SDRs filed. Something's got to be wrong in a country which is the 5th biggest financial centre in the world, right? I'm going a bit off track here, but who cares? So this is section 5. So I'm not a black letter lawyer, I'm a socio-legal lawyer, but I do look at legislation, I do interpret it, and I do pick it apart. Now, section 5 tells us what happens and what you have to do to break the secrecy legislation in the Cayman Islands. So, look at the words in yellow. Divulge, threaten, offer, attempt, divulge, willfully obtain, or attempts to obtain. Now, anyone who knows anything about criminal law in this theatre hall will know there's 2 elements to a criminal offence: actus reus, which is the act, and mens rea, which is the mental element. According to the Cayman Islands, you only need the mens rea. You only need to think about breaching this law, and you could be convicted of something. So, we see that you're guilty of 2 years and a fine of no more than US $6,200. However, what it goes on to say in the legislation is that this penalty, both the sentence and the fine, are doubled where the person commits the offence for their own reward. So if I do it for myself, to gain a benefit for myself, the penalty redoubles. And then it doubles again if you are a professional person being a lawyer, a banker, okay? Do you see where this is going? Anyone who has any doubt or any worries that their client is laundering money or evading taxes, this is hostile to whistleblowers. This is a hostile law. So in the end, in the Cayman Islands, you can spend up to 8 years in prison. Now, this is all in their legislation. Anyone can go and find this. But they don't like to talk about it. I guess what I want to show you here is in the UK, you get 2 years in prison for revenge porn. You get 2 years in prison for the unlawful marketing of knives for use in combat, trading in firearms, 5 years, racially aggravated common assault, just 2 years, intercourse with an animal, 2 years, incestuous sex with your child daughter, 7 years. But you get 8 years in the Cayman Islands for just thinking about divulging information. Do you see where the imbalance occurs? And it's one of our British overseas territories. And we're allowing it to happen. And we're saying this is okay. And we're not doing anything about it. So, I love the picture with the letterboxes. This is my last slide, actually. In conclusion, well, you've been a very good audience. Thank you for not heckling me to begin with. Offshore financial centres are criminogenic. The criminogenic risk factor for an offshore financial centre is mainly the secrecy laws, coupled with a lack of financial reporting, lack of willingness by the government. And we know that they are criminogenic. We know that people are recognising them as being criminogenic. We have the OECD in 2000 recognised offshore financial centres as drivers of money laundering and financial crime. We have 2000, the IMF recognised the same thing. 2008, the EU whitelist doesn't include any of the British overseas territories in its whitelist for best practice. 2009, the summit, Barmer, Brown, pledged to crack down on secrecy havens, recognising them as drivers of money laundering. 2009, Cayman Islands, I was there, the CFATF, FATF, Interpol summit. Secrecy havens are drivers of money laundering, and I was there in the Cayman Islands when they said that. 2012, the INCSR, the International Narcotics Control Strategy Report, every year puts secrecy havens as primary countries of concern for money laundering. Transparency International in 2015, corruption on your doorstep, we all know that report, okay? June 2015, the Grand Committee published in the Hansard reports, it's acknowledged that secrecy havens are drivers of criminal activity. And that's where I'm going to end, people. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. That's excellent.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Petr Jansky, who's an economist from Charles University in Prague. Do we do?
Yeah, I'll set it up.
Yeah, I think you need to just close mine.
All right, this is not good. Okay.
Okay.
It's not working well.
It's not.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the kind Introduction. I'll start speaking without the slides, but hopefully they will catch up with me in due time. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I'll be continuing in the topics that my co-panelists started, so I won't have as broad background and introduction as Robert had, and I won't be as specific about one jurisdiction as Mary was, but I'll be somewhere in between my colleagues. And I will definitely be speaking a lot about what John Christensen mentioned in the beginning, the financial secrecy index. So we're interested in how financial secrecy changed over the recent years, maybe since the financial crisis. We're going to be employing financial secrecy index as the tool to observe the changes in financial secrecy. And so the thanks are not going only to my co-authors of this piece, Alex Cobham and Markus Mainzer, but also to all the other co-creators of the financial secrecy index. And in the final part of my presentation, I'll be looking at the UK's role in secrecy, of which Cayman Islands is an important part. Yeah, that's all right. Okay, so these are. So I'd like to start with. There are 3 questions that I'm trying to answer. First are the latest results of the Financial Secrecy Index from 2015, from November 2015. Then I look at how it changed over the last 6 years, and lastly I look at the UK's role. So let me start with the new results, and you already saw them from John Christensen in the first presentation. And I'm not sure, kind of, most of you are probably well familiar with the Financial Secrecy Index, but there might be some in the audience who are not so familiar. So let me just review it quickly.
There's a PowerPoint presentation in the computer.
Okay. All right. So it's good that you already saw the results for 2015. So you know, John had it in his presentation, so I don't need to show it again. So it's let me make more kind of introduction of the Financial Secrecy Index, where we try to capture both the secrecy laws, which Mary cited for Cayman Islands. So we think it's important to look in detail at the various regulations and international agreements. That's a so-called secrecy score. And we combine this qualitative part with quantitative part, which we call global scale weight, where we try to capture how important the jurisdiction is. So the idea is, if there is a very secretive jurisdiction, but nobody is making use of it, it's not having such a bad impact. But maybe if there is a jurisdiction which is part of the global financial system and their laws are not perfect, they're having a negative effect as well. Yeah. Right. So some of you might remember that Switzerland was on top of the Financial Secrecy Index in 2015. The 15th place was occupied by the United Kingdom, and was another overseas territory at number 5. Some other countries close to the top were Hong Kong, Singapore, United States, Luxembourg. So these are some of the most important secrecy jurisdictions. What I'm now going to look at, not at 1 year, but how it evolved over time, which is something very attractive, and the historical versions of the Financial Secrecy Index published biannually from 2009 enables this. It's not so easy to compare it, because the methodology changed, especially with the secrecy scores. These changed significantly between 2009 and 2011. So when I show you the results,
Better, maybe we'll just go through it.
okay, cool.
Sorry, so the PowerPoint version is not.
It's not changed.
Okay.
She's the PowerPoint.
Okay. Oh. Yeah. This is other PowerPoint on other pages.
Just while we're sorting out the IT, can I just make an apology? You will have noticed quite a number of people walking in and out, including me. That is because we are dealing with a corruption court case this morning. Quite literally, John Christensen has to make a submission to the court in Luxembourg by soon after midday about the trial going on there with regard to the whistleblower. They have shortened the trial and are trying to make sure John can't appear as a witness in the defence. So we are literally constructing a submission as an alternative. And so I apologise if it appears we're all being very rude walking in and out, but this arose at about 8:30 this morning. It is a little unanticipated, and so a submission to the court is going on right now. So it does appear as though we're all being very rude walking in and out, and I apologise to the presenters, but that's what's going on. We are trying to get a guy off a charge of, well, corruption.
Could you scroll for me?
Okay, well, so I'm going to look at the long term, right? This was very short term comment from Richard. Thank you for that. But, so we are looking slightly at long term, not necessarily a historical study, but from 2009 to 2015. This is these are the 15 so-called key financial secrecy indicators and how they are comparable over time. So you can see that the 2009 year is the least comparable year. It gets better between 2011 and 2015. So when I show you results that will include 2009, please don't take them as seriously as the following years. Okay, so one question that we can look at, if we sum up for 57 comparable jurisdictions for which we have results for all 4 years. We can look at what if we sum up the value of the financial secrecy index. And this is the result. So it says that the financial secrecy has been coming down over the last 6 years. And this is, the global scale rate was basically constant. So this is mainly due to the decreasing secrecy scores. So this is something to celebrate and something to be optimistic about. So at least there is a change, and it's kind of heading in the good direction. So maybe we can discuss whether how much it should accelerate, but definitely there are people afraid among us that it could stop or reverse. So kind of this is good news from the history. So at least the financial secrecy remains high, but it's getting somewhat better. Panama was in the news lately. So this is what it looks like. So it's part of the trend in the decreasing. So there's been some decrease. It hasn't been as substantial as average for other countries, and it still remains higher than for other jurisdictions, but there's been some development. If we look at 5 top secrecy jurisdictions in the financial secrecy index in the 4 editions, 2009, 2011, 2013, 2015, these are the 7 countries. So it's the 5 top spots have been occupied only by 5 countries. So there hasn't been so much change over the time, and it's relatively concentrated. Financial secrecy is relatively concentrated in these countries. And the bars on the graph show the relative importance of these countries in the financial secrecy in a given year. So we can see some trends for some of these countries. So for example, Luxembourg and Bermuda, and to some extent Cayman Islands, and also Switzerland, I think, we can see more or less decrease in the financial secrecy index values. So these countries are becoming less and less important. On the other hand, we have some other countries that are getting bigger in financial secrecy. So that's Hong Kong or Singapore, and partly also United States. After a drop in 2009, there's a significant increase since 2011. So these are some of the dynamics that we can look with the data, and we could produce very interesting graphs. So this is more kind of an example of what we can look with the data we have. Another example, I'm not expecting you to read this graph, but there's the 15 key financial indicators, and this is the averages over the years. So there's been some there have been some changes in the average values. Some of them are stagnating, some of them are worsening. Some of them are, of course, improving because the averages are improving, and improving are the indicators mostly about international cooperation. So it's the KFSIs around 12, 13. Now let me move from the time development to the UK part of the discussion. So I think Jonathan Christensen and partly Alex already discussed it kind of definitely more from heart as UK citizens than I will ever be able to. But UK is part of the index. It's number 15 in the latest edition, but it's currently it's evaluated on its own. So it's evaluated as one country without the other overseas territories and crown dependencies that it has significant influence over. So I'm not a lawyer, but it seems to be that the laws have to be approved in Westminster, etc., etc. So there's significant influence that's not being used as much as it could be to make the secrecy jurisdictions that are part of the UK empire behave better. So we can, so as I say, UK is now considered separately, but we could look at it together with its OTs and CDs, so the overseas territories and crown dependencies. So let me briefly look at the UK secrecy network. Here as separate countries, we have United Kingdom with, these are average secrecy scores. So the secrecy score of the United Kingdom is just above 40, whereas for all the OTCDs, it's somewhere around 60, 70. So there's a huge difference. We can see relatively transparent United Kingdom, but very secretive OTCDs. When I compare it with the other countries, kind of in the above, it's not so different. So there seems to be some variance. The OTCDs are among the more secretive countries, and the UK is among the least secretive, but there's no huge difference. The same holds when I look at the differences between 2011 and 2015. If I look at the difference, percentage difference in secrecy scores and in global scale weights. Again, there's been improvement also in the UK secrecy network, but it's similar to the rest of the world. Now let me make a simple thought experiment. So what if the UK was considered together with the other countries that are now considered separately, that is the OTs and CDs. So the global scale weight would be 23% of the global total. And then the question is what secrecy score we should consider. So we can consider either the average, which would be around 65, or we can consider the lowest common denominator, which would be Turks and Caicos Islands. So we follow this logic, for example, for the United States. So we look at the state, the American state with the worst financial secrecy laws. I think in the United States is Delaware mostly. So we could follow the logic and use Turks and Caicos Islands. So I use both. We use both of these logics, and here are the results. What the FSI 2015 looked like if we use this logic and included UK together with its overseas territories. And there are two versions. One, if we use the lowest secrecy score, that's the Turks and Caicos Islands, or if we use the average. So United Kingdom would top the financial secrecy index. So this is saying to us that the UK, together with its overseas territory, has a huge global scale weight, and that's mainly driven by the UK's large share, and it has relatively high secrecy score. This is, on the other hand, driven by its overseas territories and crown dependencies. But I mean, as we academics like to say, this is work in progress. So let's see. Let's also see, it seems the policy is a work in progress. So we hope to see some work from David Cameron in the next couple of weeks. And, maybe we'll be able to run nice simulations, when the UK is going to succeed in influencing its overseas territories to adapt transparent policies. One last slide looks in detail at some of these secretive policies. Okay, these are detailed secrecy values for two groups of countries. So one is the UK and its OECD, so basically UK's network, and the other is the rest of the world. So the blue and green lines are the UK's network's values. The red, yellow values are the rest of the world. And here we are looking at the transparency, financial secrecy, banks, corporations, and trusts. The higher the value, the more transparent, the less secretive the policies are. So first, let me look at banking secrecy, which is much better in the UK network. So the blue line is above the red line, so that is saying policies in the UK network are, on average, much less secretive than in the rest of the world. So well done, UK. And there's been some improvement over the, since 2011 when we have data for this. The situation is different when we look at trusts and corporations, where the difference is small, but it's not changing and it's staying constant, basically. The UK's network is having more secretive laws and regulations regarding corporations and foundations and trusts. And we think that there's a difference also in terms of legal origins of legal systems, that the German systems, including Switzerland, is focused on banking secrecy, whereas the UK is implementing secrecy through trusts, foundations, and corporations, as we might have seen in the Panama Papers. So I think I can stop here. There's exciting time for the financial secrecy index because it's being used in the media, but also because it's undergoing review. So we are thinking of making the FSI even better than it is. For example, also to reflect changes in policies, but also changes in scale, so that maybe it can track better phenomena that we can see in the Panama Papers, and also developing a bilateral version of the FSI, which would look at the secrecy jurisdictions relevant, for example, for East Africa or for specific developing countries. And that's all from me, and I'm looking forward to following the Corruption Summit and to see whether UK will be the leader in transparency, or whether it will be relatively transparent leader of very secretive network as it is today.
Thanks, Peter. 3 brilliant, excellent, really interesting presentations. So I'm going to we've got about a quarter of an hour or so, Roland. So I'm going to hand over to Roland, who's a Professor of Political Economy here at City, as our discussant.
Thank you very much. I'll be quick. Peter talked about working progress. This is going to be discussion in progress. Because Alex hopefully yesterday told me there is a paper, one paper, but it's ending. So I listened very carefully to you guys, and I was not quickly to what I'm saying. Let's start with the paper of Robert. Robert, of course, you're talking about something that doesn't exist officially, tax havens. I think you posted you denied it. But laughter apart, or aside, I think the key issue is a debate or discussion about perspective. The conventional perspective, where the relationship, development, and so on and so forth. We tend to take the kind of state perspective. There are states in the world, are sovereign, and they have a right to write their own laws, and so on and so forth. And there are some states which are democratically organized, well organized, well run, and some states which are fragile or corrupt. Now, it's the states which are well run, democratically elected governments and so forth, their job is to try to help those countries which have these corrupt governments, and they do. They help with aid, right? There are institutions within the World Bank which is very concerned with the issue of corruption, as we know. And of course, there are national institutions which are concerned with aid and also with corruption. That's the kind of story. That's the perspective from which the discussion is taking place. Not exactly correct. I mean, that's of course is not part of the discussion because they belong to something else. It's to do with fiscal issues, very monetary issues, not to do with aid or development, say in Africa. It's not correct because I think the World Bank has recognized tax havens are significant to some extent. I think the World Bank even relied on some work done by TGM for a while, short while. But that's the kind of view. DFID, the Department of International Trade and Investment in the UK, in fact, encouraged the setting up of Caribbean jurisdiction tax havens. That was DFID's role. And I don't think that changed and so on. Of course, there's another perspective. Completely, I think that's what you're presenting. And the other perspective presents the kind of aids, elites, and tax haven nexus as a kind of a business relationship. That's the legal nexus. Each aspect of this nexus, the aid is a big business. Elites, of course, see their states as a form of a business, and the plumbing of that particular nexus operates through tax havens. Now, here we have kind of contrast of two perspectives. Are we taking the state perspective, which effectively we have a situation of ungrateful Africans, so getting all these aids and look what they're doing, or we're taking the view in which we see aid, elites, and tax havens are necessary. I think that's the right way of looking at it. And the effect of that is not only affecting deeply the ability of countries in Africa or Central Asia or Latin America to get revenue, but in fact to draw the work of Mick Moore, who is not here today. Mick arguing, of course, that the problem with that particular nexus is that the interaction between elites and the people for the taxation, which was really at the heart of the development of state formation in Europe. We reached a position today, what we call democratically elected or well-run governments. So these 200-300 years of engagement in which elites had to engage with their own people because they had to tax them. That particular dynamics is not working. It's still that's the effect of it. So that's, I think, what's about really, therefore, is what political scientists call the very conventional economics, agenda control. Who controls the agenda? Who tells the story of what's going on here? Are we telling it from the conventional state perspective, in which, as I said, you end up with corrupt East Asian, corrupt Latin Americans, and so forth, ungrateful ones, or you are telling this better people. I think that's kind of the partly what you're trying to do, and of course partly what the FSR is trying to do to change the agenda. Because the agenda itself. Coming to Mary's paper, I like this notion of cream. The only problem is, of course, I won't be able to pronounce it. Yeah, that's right. I like it very much because it's intuitively correct, but I think it's also important, both conceptually, but I think also from an activist point of view, not a activist myself, but because I think we are constantly caught in this kind of binary discussion about legality, okay, in which there seems to be an outrage about the Panama or Luxembourg or HSBC or any of those stories, an outrage of it, and then of course you've got some people, particularly from the industry, say, but you know, it's illegal. And the debate is about legality, illegality, which is very difficult to, on one hand, to fight it, to counter it. Essentially, what people from the industry say, we are doing our job, we simply follow the rules as they are. The rules are created and established by governments. It's their business. We have nothing to do with it. You change the rules, we will follow accordingly. It's illegal, illegal. Your notion is basically to identify this as an area of concern. All right? So to move away from the legal, illegal debate, let's understand this is an area of concern. This is an area that facilitates, that makes it easy for criminality to take place. We shouldn't simply ask ourselves, is it legal or illegal? We should ask ourselves, do we want such areas, such spaces to exist? And what do we do about them? So I think it's a very interesting point of view. I didn't read, of course, capture very quickly your point about that legal provision in Cayman, and what it appears to me what Cayman is trying to do. What Cayman regulation is about is to protect the customers in a different way, or what it's. The way Cayman and other jurisdictions operate is something which is of great concern to the customers. Essentially, you pass on your property to a nominee director who you never met, with the hope that they do absolutely nothing. Okay? But that's, for those people who do that, that's quite an anxious moment to pass it to somebody. I think this particular law that you described, but this is basically there to protect the professionalism of these nominee directors. Okay? So they will not do anything to harm the underlying license, because that's the business of Cayman. Or that's the way I understand it. Coming, coming to this representation by the FSI. I was privileged yesterday, not all of us were here, but there was a small meeting of DGM, which I was privileged, where there was a presentation from a person from the European Union who is an expert in indices. Right? There is such a thing. In fact, the European Union has a desk, has a research center on indices, and that person gave a very helpful talk yesterday, and I think that person gave you guys a clean bill of health. She made some suggestions, but what I understood from her is that, in fact, she's quite impressed with the methodology, because all of the methodology of the FSR. And from what I understand, the European Union may now begin to incorporate this particular indices in the work. So that's quite significant. I was very impressed that you actually managed to identify a person that there is such a thing, and that you take your work so seriously. That's I was very impressed by it. Okay. There are various questions that arose out of the methodology itself, which was discussed yesterday and is discussed here today. I think one of the biggest questions is, of course, it was discussed the role of the US, as you said. The methodology basically is skewed towards scale. So you try to capture both secrecy and scale, because if you're a very small island, then you're very strictly working, you don't have such a punch in the world economy, and as a result, the US coming up very high, but the US basically is a developer. That's quite interesting question for me. I'm not sure that, and that's a question to you guys, whether Delaware is really, it's extremely opaque. I understand the date, but I'm not sure that Delaware is really used as a vehicle for tax avoidance and evasion of money laundering. I don't know if that was kind of demonstrated before, but it is very big. The other question, of course, that comes out is about what I call the Second British Empire. And that is, you shouldn't treat the City of London independently the way the data is constructed. You should understand that the City of London really operates through these jurisdictions, like the Channel Islands, the overseas territories, but also, in my view, other jurisdictions like Singapore, Cyprus, Hong Kong, which have a kind of historical legacy relationship. And that's what we're trying to capture here. Once you get that into the picture completely changes. And I think that's quite an important demonstration of what's going on. The FSI index demonstrates that opacity is declining. And I think all the evidence that I could see, data, money flows, corroborate that. Okay? So in that sense, there is a decline. And I think the Panama Papers as well, but I think the media picture that a lot of what's going on there, many of these entities were closing down last year. There is a decline. So in that sense, that's quite good. There's a move to Asia, which is very serious. That's what you capture, and that is corroborated by other data. And that's my point. Thank you very much.
I'm getting signal 10 minutes or 10 questions, 10 minutes. Yes, so thank you, Roland. Does anyone have any questions?
Just one note regarding what Ronan said about Delaware. I agree with you that Delaware probably is not, or I'm not sure that Delaware is used to facilitate money laundering and tax avoidance. I suspect that Nevada and Wyoming are. So their laws are strictly about secrecy. Delaware is more about corporate officers. One question or comment I have to there is that if offshore secrecy centers are criminogenic, and the responsibility there is there even a word such as criminogenic and no one is doing anything about it, and the law seems to discourage whistleblowing, isn't the obvious conclusion, well, nothing is obvious to us in academics, right? You need to prove. But isn't the conclusion, the logical conclusion, that they're criminogenic by design? That people, their policymakers establish law to facilitate this specific criminogenic behavior, because maybe the expectation is that this behavior will not affect their society. It will be other societies that are affected. We just get confused.
There was sort of a mixture of questions there, so I'm going to answer what I thought you were asking me. I think offshore financial centres, I know Tax Justice Network like to call them secrecy havens or secrecy jurisdictions, yes, are criminogenic by design in terms of the legislation that evolved when they were created. So if, for example, with the Cayman Islands, we saw the diminishing turtle fishing industry, and something had to take its place, something had to build up an economy. Secrecy legislation helped do that, it helped attract people, but by their very nature they are criminogenic because they have attracted criminal persons. That is a criminogenic risk factor, that is a definition. It's a factor that increases criminal activity, and that's what secrecy laws do. In terms of policy making, we should be looking to change these laws. I agree with you in that respect. Will they be changed? Will we actually do anything about them while the UK is benefiting from those overseas territories and crown dependencies themselves? I don't know.
Do you want to add anything? Don't have to.
I'm not an expert on the US secrecy laws, so I'm probably not going to continue in the discussion. Maybe colleagues, if they want to do it, or we can wait for Jim Henry.
Okay. And run over there. I think we're having trouble with the mic. More techie drama going on.
I can speak up.
Thank you.
My question's for Marion, but thanks to all of you for I was really struck by your clean rendering of the links between the legal practices of tax havens and the way in which they encourage such finality, in part because some of the advocacy that I do in the US, when I'm trying to introduce this idea to people who understand the tax side, don't understand the finance side, and don't understand the link between the two, I have made a rough comparison that's very similar. The same things, tools that people use to legally avoid tax are the things that people are using to illegally avoid tax or commit criminal activity. So I'm glad to see that you put some academic thought into this. So it's my controversy. My question for you is more of a thought on, to your knowledge, do you know of any people in your academic space on the US side or have looked at the US spaces and made similar analyses of the onshore tax havens or secrecy havens? Because if there were such people, from an advocacy standpoint, that's a potent reframing of the problem posed by secrecy jurisdictions. Right now, most people who know anything about it are looking at purely from one angle and seeing it purely as sort of a question of legality. But our efforts to actually bring in that criminality perspective are ones we think that are going to be reframing for advocacy perspective.
No. I don't really know anybody. The first person I guess I've just met is you. I don't really know anybody who looks at criminogenics in terms of offshore financial centres. We've looked at criminogenics, like I said, in terms of physical spaces where there are more bar brawls, or physical spaces where there are more burglaries. But nobody's really looking at the fact offshore financial centres have these novel, very different sort of social constructs. They are small island states. They almost evolve out of a bubble, out of a trade that's long gone, whether that's salt mining or turtle fishing, and they've had to come up with something that upholds their economy. Now, financial secrecy laws are a pillar that uphold an economy in the Cayman Islands. You challenge that, the pillar crumbles, the economy crumbles. That's what people don't want to hear. They don't want to hear any relevance that this is something that causes and is conducive to criminal conduct. Now, I would argue the toss, of course it is. The fact that the Cayman Islands don't prosecute money launderers and don't have money laundering prosecutions, and for the amount of money that flows and rests in those jurisdictions, there are no suspicious transaction reports. This is crazy. It does not make sense. But yeah, good to see you're making the link as well. Like, it's nice to...
I'll be hunting for an academic in the US.
You find one and send them to me. I'd be interested to know. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. So we've got a question here and then Prem.
Yes, my question is to Robert and Mary with regards to offshore tax havens compared to onshore tax shelters. And if the basis of any tax scheme is to receive a tax credit, and if there's some palatial accounting such that there is no tax debit, and if that in the onshore tax sheltering schemes distorts the budget that is pronounced from the throne to create tax incentivized economic stimulation, etc., onshore, has anybody done the math to show that if you added up all these tax credits issued onshore, they would actually total and compare if there was really an accounting structure which was double entry bookkeeping, it would all add up to what is actually.
Robert, to answer that. Any thoughts on that?
I think that actually speaks to what I was trying to propose as the triple threat effect. But I'm not aware of any actual studies that have gone to look at the figures specifically. But it is actually a real problem and a real question to be addressed. And I don't know if Alex might be interested in this. Maybe we can pursue it further. But it's something that I feel, especially for developing countries, it becomes a real headache in terms of trying to actually look at what are the cost-benefit analysis of offering this tax incentives, and then how corporates then structure their business to shift it to offshore jurisdictions. And that's what I was trying to espouse, the third characteristic of that, which is the double taxation agreement, which then means that countries tend to sort of relinquish their taxing rights and just try and correlate this or link it with what it means for the overall collection within the country.
Yeah, I'm not, I have been a researcher, I trawl the literature, I'm not aware of any study on that area that you're talking about. Are you sort of trying to say that perhaps this is an area that needs to be looked at more so than offshore financial centres? This is in fact more of a problem.
Well, you asked me a question, I had to answer it. I think it is a very significantly greater problem than tax havens. And I have done some research and measurements in this and how it's done and how to prevent it. And there are people who are being quite brave on this in some countries to challenge the government, which in their eyes is as criminal, if not more criminal, than offshore.
Thank you. Ben, should we probably take your question as the last question?
Thank you for letting me have the last word. Sometimes I want to really link all three excellent presentations. The issue is about secrecy. But I think there is a new variety of secrecy which we haven't really received much attention from our community. And that is secrecy within the FDI agreement. The FDI agreements are secret. I have half a dozen copies of various agreements. They're not publicly available. If you look at them, they create a state within a state because the contract is frozen. They call it rather misleadingly stabilization clauses. And it simply says, I looked at one relating to oil wells and pipeline in Chad and Cameroon. It simply clearly says, throughout the life of this project, no tax will be payable. Project would be 100 years. Nothing about offshore, nothing about hiding, anything else. It's simply as bold as that. No tax. For that project exists in its own state. Everything else around it can have health and safety laws, tax laws, changes, minimum wage, but you can't disturb that. If you do, you've got to pay huge compensation to the oil companies in this case. And the case can't be heard in courts either. In Chad, Cameroon, or anywhere else, has to be decided by a business panel based in London, Paris, or Washington, D.C. I think it is time, we have an excellent comments being made earlier about tax dodging and human rights. And human rights obligations apply to corporations too. They are not exempt from the human rights laws. But it is something which has really escaped our community altogether. So I would really suggest that we start linking these things to human rights. Offshore world is important in terms of secrecy, but look at what's happening here. So what we need to look at is the state-corporation nexus. Now that is, UK taxpayers are funding oil companies, for example, through trade fairs, embassy support in other countries. And these then go and impose these clauses on developing countries. And then the whole document is secret. I only got involved because some NGOs asked me to look at it. They said, what on earth is this about? And one document I'm reading now is 417 pages long. FDI agreement, written in dense legal language, and I have no idea so far where it's leading to, but I'm trying to make sense of it. But I think as a community, we should broaden our horizons and look at these things. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Would anyone like to just respond to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think the thing with the taxes and FDIs is an important one, and I can see, for example, on the example of my country, Czech Republic. So in this sense, Czech Republic could be considered easily a tax haven because we are doing this as well. I don't think for 100 years, but it's all the criticism you explain is valid for the Czech Republic. And I wonder what to do about it. I think it's difficult. For example, for me as an empirical economist, it's difficult to compare it across countries or across time, to get some comparable data on it. So it might be more on a case-by-case basis that we might shed more light on it. You can see in some work with Alex Coben here, we look at something like this in international comparable way when we look at FDI investment in various countries, and we look at how big the investment is, how much taxes these countries are paying. So that's going into that direction. It's work on misalignment of profits, taxes paid, activities. So there might be a direction that we might deepen also towards human rights respect.
Okay. Thanks. I think we will leave it there if that's all, because we're 10 minutes into the break. But thank you all. Please thank our panellists. We're due back in here at 11:30, so we can kind of start promptly. So have your tea and your thanks and get on. Thank you very much. Let me see if I can.